In a tight market, buyers don't lose homes because they weren't qualified. They lose them because they weren't confident, and sellers can feel that. Welcome back, guys, to another episode of Closing the Deal. I am one of your hosts, Zach Dickson, and today we are talking about why pre-approval confidence matters and how this directly impacts whether or not your offer gets accepted. Super excited for today's episode, and as always, sitting across from me on my screen today is my co-host, Sam Enright. What is going on today, Sam? How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm doing well. Excited to break down some pre-approval confidence with our fellow listeners here and talk about why it's important and how it actually can impact you getting your offer accepted.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think this is definitely a good topic for the last 3, 4, 5 years, especially with the type of market that we've been in. You know, a lot of buyers, as we've talked about on a couple episodes back here in 2026. You know, they like to get started on Zillow, looking on Realtor.com at homes, and they maybe fall in love with those things before they even know what their budget is. And having that confidence when you do get started with the home search, and having that confidence when you get started writing offers specifically, can absolutely make all the difference whether or not you do get that home or beat out the competition per se. So definitely a good one for the time period in the market that we're in as a whole, for sure.
Yeah, definitely agree. It's it's been this market for 4 years now. So definitely really important to know and understand, and obviously have that kind of in your back pocket as you go out and start looking at homes. And more than just that, understanding where your strong suits are and how to structure an offer based on those strong suits, right? To make sure that you're getting the best deal, but also making it enticing enough for a seller to consider the offer and ultimately take it.
For sure. And it's I've been wondering over the last couple of years when we're going to start kind of shifting a little bit. And in some pockets, some areas, and in some price points, it certainly has shifted back to kind of an equilibrium medium there. But I was actually on a showing with a buyer, I think last weekend, and at a pretty a decent price point. And we got an offer or we got a message before we even went into the showing that they already had multiple offers, and that was on a Saturday morning, and the property went on the market on a Friday. So it's very, very still relevant to the stuff that we're going through, stuff we're seeing in the real estate market as a whole.
So with that said, guys, ultimately what we want your largest takeaway to be from today's episode, and the biggest anchor point, the question that we want to answer is, ultimately, how does pre-approval confidence influence whether or not your offer is going to be accepted? And I think we have to start with the right framing of this, right? And so taking a look at, what does, a tight market expose that brings the need for us to have a really tight, good pre-approval, strong confidence in yourself as a buyer when going out and putting these offers together. So Zach, when looking at a market, obviously we've talked about, the last couple of years and how the market has been. So what would you say are the biggest things that, a tight market exposes when it comes to, this side of things?
Well, it definitely will expose, the lack of confidence or the uncertainty that we have. Again, if we go into a showing and we already fall in love with this property that we walk into, and we don't necessarily have a pre-approval, number one, or a very good pre-approval, number two, that is just going to have a trickle down effect on how we operate with our offer. And ultimately, in a tight market, and when we have multiple offer situations, the timing that we have in these scenarios is very, very little. We can't really sit on a decision for a day or 2 or 3 days or a week. By that time, they're going to accept another offer that already does have this confident pre-approval, already does have this certainty that they have, the financial backing to be able to afford this property, that their offer is a strong offer. Ultimately, if we're sitting on that for too long, we've already missed our opportunities. So it goes back to stuff that we've talked about in previous episodes, the prep work, having that confidence and having the certainty that the numbers that are laid out to us in front of us are good ones, and that we feel confident in moving forward with those. Ultimately, having the hesitation is just going to put us back a step, put us behind the eight ball. And ultimately, when a seller already has offers, they're not going to be sitting around and waiting for people to get their ducks in a row. People already do have their ducks in a row, and they're going to go with those offers that do ultimately have that stuff lined up. So it's just, it ultimately amplifies the uncertainty when you're in a tight market, because of the other factors, the external factors that we really can't control, of other people making offers, having that stuff lined up as a whole.
Yeah, for sure. I think, inside of that, ultimately, just kind of how you're discussing, the showing for the client last week, right? There is still situations in which that level of quickness and decisiveness is still needed in today's market, right? You get these houses that pop up, and I think we've talked about this. I think there's a strong conditioning for most people at this point that they want a specific type of house, they want these specific things. And so obviously when you have kind of the same wants and desires from a house that a lot of other people are going to have, right, that's going to up the level of competition just in and of itself before homes even hit the market. Anybody else who's shopping that has the same, sort of criteria that they're looking for when it comes to a house, it's automatically going to be competition when it comes to putting in those offers. And so, being solidified in what you have in your pre-approval, being solidified in the numbers that you've discussed with your lender, being solidified in those things allows you to, I don't want to use the word quickness, because ultimately, right, it's more of a decisiveness, knowing that you have done the prerequisites to getting in that position. So it's almost, you know, confidence and preparation ultimately, right? We're not just kind of going in and winging it just because we like it. And, we don't really know if we're going to be able to afford the payment and what that's going to look like. It's more of a, hey, we've done the due diligence on the back end. So we feel confident and comfortable going ahead and moving on this house quickly, in situations where maybe where it's different. Maybe they haven't gotten in the financing. Maybe they're just browsing. We see this a lot with clients that just browse, and then all of a sudden, they see that one house that comes up, and it's like, boom, okay, perfect. I got to get in touch with my lender today. I got to get all these docs over. I got to do this. I got to do this. And then inside of that, there is it leaves a feeling of some uncertainty, right? Because you haven't really had time to process and deal with all these things. You're getting these numbers thrown at you, you're getting all these different things. We got to get to the showing. We got to check all this out. And then you could leave at the end of that in a 24, 48 hour period feeling like, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? So, if that's something, again, we can get off in many different segues from this, I'm sure, but I guess we'll keep it more on more on pace with the episode. But that's the biggest thing that, just to kind of back up what you had said about, the tight markets and how it comes and goes with, making sure that you are in a position to be confident and act decisively.
For sure. And that's a really good example, is because we do that, we see that all the time, is people not really, just browsing, and then they see that one property that they love, and they want to get going on it. And then it's just amplified ultimately when that property ends up being into a multi-offer situation, and a lot of interest, because it's just, you have to all of those feelings that you just described are added to by the external factor of other people feeling those exact same feelings as well. And so just kind of really take a look at the whole picture, and try to have that prep work done. And ultimately, I think some of it, I would say most of it, does fall on you as the buyer, but the communication from your real estate agent does need to be there in these scenarios too. Making sure that you as the buyer are aware that this is going to be a very competitive property. Having that expectation kind of enables you to have that prep work done, or have a little bit more, urgency in getting that prep work done too. you as the buyer probably aren't going to be very aware of kind of how the market's turning in your area, how it's going in your area. So that really is a job of the real estate agent, is to make sure that expectation is set for any specific property, any specific market. So you're well aware that you do need to have those things done before you get started.
Yeah, for sure. Love it. Um, so kind of taking us into, the next part here, what would you say, obviously you've written up multiple contracts, worked with multiple clients. So, tell me, I guess, a little bit, because obviously we just described two different types of people here, right? We described the type of person who is kind of sitting on the fence, browsing, and then, ready to jump into action. Then you have people that, I think maybe are a little bit more aware of the situation and, know they want to buy a house, and, maybe they're not necessarily, going to open houses and showings, every single weekend, but, they have done the due diligence and the prep work in the beginning to at least understand where their budget is and where they need to be at. So how would you say, when it comes to both types of people, the compare contrast of how that confidence shows up when actually going and writing an offer?
Well, you're always going to see this in really just any aspect of life. You know, being confident in what you're going to do is going to enable you to make better, clearer decisions as a whole. And ultimately, this applies in real estate and writing offers as well. When you're confident in your numbers and you're confident in the situation that you're in, you're going to write cleaner offers, and you're going to be able to make, like you mentioned, maybe not decisions quicker, but more decisively. You know, when we're going through those terms, you're going to understand the terms that we're talking about. You're going to understand how they impact you as the buyer and how they impact the seller as well. Because ultimately, that is what we're trying to get at when we make these offers and we write these offers up. Ultimately, we want your offer to be accepted. So we have to kind of find that middle ground on where it works for you as the buyer and where it also works for you, the seller as well, especially in a tight market when you have multiple offers coming in, because typically it's going to be very competitive, and you want to try and, you know, make that as advantageous for the seller as possible without giving up your leverage, without giving up, you know, the things that you're looking for. Confident buyers are going to communicate clearly with their entire team, not necessarily just the agent, but they're going to be having open lines of communication with their lender as well when they're going through that pre-approval process, and, you know, taking all of the information into account. And I'm sure that you can touch on this a little bit as well, but, you know, having buyers that kind of withhold information during the pre-approval process, that's not going to be a recipe for success or a recipe for real confidence as you get to start writing that offer, because it will show up ultimately when you get into, you know, if you're lucky enough to have your offer accepted at that point, it's absolutely going to show up in the post acceptance time period. But if you are, you know, writing that offer and don't feel confident in your pre-approval because you know that you didn't give the correct information to your lender, that ultimately is going to hinder you in the process as well. And so, just kind of wrapping this up, ultimately, confidence directly ties into execution, and that really just applies for anything in life, in my opinion. Just having the confidence and the wherewithal of knowing that you're in a good prep work spot to make a decision is ultimately going to land you more success moving forward than it would not. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, a couple of key points there. I think we also have to, look at ourselves, right? And you have to look at your professionals that you're working with, because ultimately confidence is a drip down effect as well, depending, because ultimately you're not going to give yourself financing, right? You're not going to go out and find the home and write the contract up, or write the contract offer up yourself. So there are other people that are involved in this, right? And so you can kind of feel that confidence. You can kind of feel that feeling generally through the team, when it comes to the open lines of communication and everything that goes on with that. So, it's really important that, like Zach mentioned, that you have that upfront, honest and conversation, with your lender about what's going on, the key factors that you're looking at, those sort of things, and anything that could pop up. Because I can assure you, I've been doing this business for 7, 8 years now, and there is no stone left unturned when it comes to approving somebody for a house. So to think that you may get away with withholding certain information, it's not going to come up. I assure you, there's so many different, things put in place to make sure that those sort of situations do not arise. So, being open and honest up front is usually the biggest thing, because ultimately that's what we're here for. We're here to help work through those things, and make sure that you understand, hey, this is what it's going to take. This is the work that we're going to have to do around this sort of situation or whatever it is that you have going on, and go from there. So I think there's also, a little bit of a responsibility, or more than a little bit, a responsibility on your professionals that you're working with, on your lender, on your agent, to make sure that you are also confident, because you could be confident in something and maybe your professionals are not, and that's going to leak down into you to where you're like, I don't know about this. I'm not getting great feedback here. I'm not getting great, energy vibes that this is going to go our way. And so, getting with people that, again, I think all boils back down to communication and just being upfront and honest about everything, and working with people that, also value that as well.
Couldn't agree more, brother. Could not agree more. So moving on to our, next segment of the episode, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what sellers and agents are going to notice when they do get that offer in hand, when they do get the pre-approval letter that you have in hand as well. Because again, when you send in your offer, in here in Central Ohio, in the Columbus Board of Realtors contract that I standardly use, in the contract, it actually has a provision that states that the buyer has already delivered the pre-approval letter or will deliver the pre-approval letter within a certain amount of days. And typically speaking, for me, I'm always going to be a proponent of sending that pre-approval letter with the offer, because again, it just shows the seller and the agent that you have already done your due diligence. You have been pre-approved for this exact number, that you can afford the property. And ultimately, when you don't have that upfront with the offer, that will show to the seller and to the agent. It'll show that you haven't done your prep work, you haven't done your due diligence, and that will, kind of, like you mentioned, have a trickle down effect on confidence to them. At that point, they won't necessarily feel as confident that you're a qualified buyer for the property. And so with that being said, ultimately, having a clean file, and when you are having that pre-approval done, the due diligence done, having a clean file, it reduces the perceived risk for sellers, for agents as a whole. I've gotten more phone calls than I would have imagined from sellers, asking for how confident I feel in my buyer's pre-approval letter, which is, obviously I feel confident in my buyer's pre-approval. That's why I sent it over, and that's why we did our due diligence. But ultimately, they are doing their due diligence on their part to kind of reduce the risk for their client. And I'm sure that you, as the lender, have also gotten those types of phone calls as well from selling agents where your buyers have, submitted offers and whatnot. But it's just, ultimately, clean files are going to reduce that risk as a whole. And you want to, as you submit offers, especially in tight markets, you want to have the least risk profile as possible. And going off of risk, sellers and agents are going to evaluate the risk as a whole and not necessarily just the price. I think that's something that buyers, that especially first-time home buyers, get hung up on when they start writing offers. They want to just automatically go to the highest price when they're in a multi-offer situation, and ultimately, that's not necessarily always going to be the satisfactory condition for sellers. Typically they want a path of least resistance to closing, whether that's giving up $5,000 on the selling price, or but whatever it may be. However they can get to the closing table the easiest way possible, that's typically the deal that they are going to take. And so ultimately, I guess the point with this section was that sellers and agents are going to notice if you're not confident. They're going to, be able to kind of see through those things very, very easily, if you're not confident and not ready to go when you get that offer submitted to them.
Yeah. Yes, and to piggyback on what you had said, yes, I have. I mean, we worked with a mutual client that, I actually did get a phone call from the list agent, prior to offer acceptance, and just general questions. We actually we have a client in contract right now that, we received a phone call from the listing agent as well, just asking, about kind of the Oh, that's ultimately the overarching theme of the phone call, right? Is how confident are you that this buyer is going to get to the closing table? Obviously, it's not like we sit here and discuss, intricacies of the loan and financial data with the listing agent, but just a kind of a pat on the back and just like, hey, this, we're good here. You have a really good, solid buyer that's putting an offer in on this. And that's why ultimately we put as much work into the pre-approval process as we do, is to ensure that when those phone calls inevitably do happen, that we are able to pass that information along, and feel confident in that, because ultimately that can be felt by tone, can be felt by energy levels, even on a phone. I mean, you guys all know, we as people have high BS meters. So we can tell when people are, maybe not giving us the full truth. And so, we try to do as much as we can in the beginning. That way we can avoid, or not avoid, but make sure that when we are saying those things, we actually feel them and we actually believe them. Right. So, and then kind of getting into some misconceptions here with pre-approvals, right? So, um, I think a lot of people will treat a pre-approval and think that just because you're getting a pre-approval, that somehow that means you're committing to this process, right? We have people that we pre-approve that, you know, go 6 months, don't find a house, and they're still out there looking, right? And so it's not necessarily a this is 100% happening sort of thing, but it helps them understand where their position is, where they currently are at, and maybe where they need to get to in order to put themselves in the position that they're looking to be in. So if you want to buy a $250,000, $300,000 house, and right now your budget's 200,000, then we can work on steps for you to get to that extra 50,000, for you to get to that extra 100,000, and what can be done when it comes to debt to income ratios, income, those different things, and so I think it's really more about actually just understanding where you're at, and so that you can position yourself properly, right? So just because you reach out to a lender and get a pre-approval letter or get a pre-qualification and have those conversations doesn't mean that you have to go buy next week, or that you have to buy anytime in the next 3 months, ultimately, right? I know for most people that's the goal, but I don't think that there's any harm in reaching out and having those initial conversations if that's something that's even on your radar in 6 to 12 months, which is exactly why we started out all of our, content this year talking about the long game, right? Talking about a 90-day plan, talking about a much longer period of time, and understanding that just having those conversations doesn't necessarily mean you're on the hook to do anything at all. So I think that's really, really important, because I think the longer that you push out a pre-approval and you're browsing and you're looking at different things and you get excited and then you become attached, I think you're setting yourself up for a lot more disappointment. Are there clients that can literally walk off the street and see a house and apply for a loan, for a pre-approval same day and get pre-approved? Yes. But does that necessarily mean that that's the best route to go about it? No, I would say that it's not. Just because that situation works for them doesn't mean it works for everybody, right? If you have credit things that need to be worked out, if there's some income issues, if you haven't been on your job long enough, there's all these different things that if you don't necessarily know what's going on, you may think that you're way far out. You may think that you can buy today. There's just so many different outcomes. So I think that's a really important thing for people to kind of like change in their head, is to understand that just because you reach out about a pre-approval does not mean that you are committed, or that you need to commit to a specific house and a specific timeline.
For sure, because again, like there's no real negative, in my opinion, to doing the prep work, right? There's going to be a negative in not doing the prep work, absolutely, but there's no real negative in knowing where you stand and where you need to get to.
The biggest negative for people is that they think that because they get an inquiry on their credit, that all of a sudden like their score is going to drop 50 points from an inquiry or something like that. And it's like that is not how credit works. So I can assure you guys. And I think people that they buy into this because they'll be on Credit Karma, right? Credit Karma will say they have a 750, and then we may pull credit into 710. And then they see Credit Karma drop down to 710. They're like, oh my gosh, you guys did an inquiry. My credit dropped, 40 points. Well, that's not reality. If we pulled the credit and it was 710, then you never truly had a 750 in the first place. You know what I mean? And so, but people use that because I've heard that from people before. Well, I don't want my credit pulled because, I've seen my score drop 30, 40 points. Like, unless you're getting one to two inquiries a month for 12, 24 months straight, like inquiries are not, people that have 2 or 3 inquiries in a 12-month period are not noticing that much of a difference in their credit score. I can assure you, it just doesn't exist. Make your payments on time, keep your credit utilization low, and keep your accounts open for length of credit history. And those 3 things right there will supersede anything that comes with an inquiry. Sorry, I just had to put that in there just because I know that that's what people will say to what you just said is,
Absolutely.
well, there is a downside. I don't want my credit pulled. You know what I mean? It's like, first off, we can do soft pulls that don't even leave inquiries. So you could avoid that right off the rip. But even if we did do a hard inquiry, like, it's not the end of the world.
Absolutely. Great myth buster there. I like that a lot out of you for sure. I like that. So finishing up kind of with this segment a little bit, a reframe or, a shift in perspective is kind of needed when we are talking about that pre-approval and doing that prep work, diving into it. Having the pre-approval isn't going to necessarily guarantee that you're going to win, but a lack of it and a lack of confidence pretty much guarantees that you won't when you are in these tight markets or in these multi-offer situations. So just some food for thought, definitely a little bit of, kind of shift of perspective and just reframe as a whole when we talk about the pre-approval and confidence as a whole.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, guys, obviously we want to leave you with, some things here. So, just a little bit of, that boost, that reassurance. Confidence can be built before you guys ever even go out and start looking at homes, right? You can start that process from the very beginning of understanding your options, understanding what's going on, getting a pre-approval letter, having the conversations with everybody that's involved in this, right? When you're having your conversations with your lender and your financing's intact, when you're having conversations with your agent and you guys are very clear, you're very upfront about what goals you're looking to achieve with purchasing your home, whether that's making more room for your family, whether that's acreage, whether that's, whatever the case may be, right? Having those conversations up front, that is where confidence is built from, is making sure that everybody is co-aligned on the same exact outcome here. Because if we're all aligned on that, then we can help facilitate that a lot easier. And I think another big thing is learning, right? Learning takes away, obviously you have to combine learning and action. You can't just learn everything and sit back and never do anything, because that's not going to produce confidence either. But learning combined with action is an unbeatable way to build confidence, in my opinion, just from my own personal life, just from business, everything that I have been involved in. When I learn how to do something and then I go and implement that and I see the way that it works, that is it reassures me inside, okay, this is the right path, or this is the right thing to be doing, right? I learned this thing, I've gone and implemented it, and now here we are. So it's never too early to start learning. That's the whole reason we put this podcast on. It's the whole reason, we spend our time putting, this content out, is so that hopefully you guys find this as an ability to learn different things that are going to hopefully help you save time down the road, so you feel less unprepared when you go into your mortgage transaction or your home purchase.
For sure. And I think my lasting message, I think, for the, listeners is, competition can be scary, to be honest, for people, whether that's in real estate or in professional life, or, whatever it may be. Competition, I feel like, can be a little bit scary for somebody and for people as a whole. And so just having confidence and having that prep work done before you go into competition, it's just going to make it significantly more manageable. You want to have clarity. You want to be able to feel confident in the decisions that you are making, being decisive, not necessarily just being urgent and having to make a decision right now because the deadline is in front of you, because of the competition in front of you. So just want to make sure that we are reiterating that, confidence, it makes all the difference when we are talking about tight markets and multi-offer situations.
Yeah, I think that it's going to bring in a good point for me to kind of hopefully drive this home for everybody, because I just finished reading up a couple of Tim Grover's books, which if none of you know who Tim Grover is, he was the personal trainer for Michael Jordan for like 15, 16 years. And then he personally trained Kobe Bryant. And it's just like inside of that book, he gets into the psyche of Michael Jordan and Kobe and what allowed them to be as great as they were. And it was ultimately just like what you talked about, right? The confidence comes in the preparation. The amount of work that these guys put in before they ever even touched a basketball court, before they ever even went out and played a game. They watched enough film, they went back, they reviewed where they struggled with, and they made sure that they had all the fundamentals down. And then that allowed them to have that confidence that the work had already been put in on the background to go out and perform to the level that they needed to. And I think that's a great example for us in just life in general, right? Like, you can't get there without the learning, without the work, and then that is what breeds the confidence so that you can go out and do the things that you know you need to do.
Absolutely, brother. Great points there for sure. For sure. So that will wrap us up for today's episode. Hopefully, you guys got the main takeaway that confidence is a great thing to have in life in general, in real estate. Hopefully, you guys found some value. And of course, again, we drop episodes every Friday afternoon at 12 p.m. Feel free to check us out at any point, at any time. If you guys ever have any questions, we are always here for you as well. And hopefully, you guys have a great rest of your day.
Awesome, guys. Appreciate it. See ya.